Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second week of Sleepypasta Short Story Showcase. I am your host, Yvonne Weissenheimer, and today we have a very special story by a quite interesting applicant. Please approach the stage.
Him by Zen Creepypasta. It started as a drawing, an unconscious scribble that turned into a malevolent face. I didn't think anything of it at first. It was a stupid doodle. I was in a psychology lecture, listening to someone explain Milgram's obedience experiment, when my hand wandered the page aimlessly. It was a surprise at first to see such a simple, creepy face emerge from quick scribbling. It was scraggy and stupid, just a pair of rough eyes and a Joker-like grin that was far too wide. He was quiet at first. I would notice every few days that I'd be drawing the same horrid face in the corner of a page. I wasn't worried, of course. It was just ink. I'd barely think about it, just notice every so often that the same image would emerge, and then that was it. I wouldn't draw him again for ages. I like to draw. I can't say I'm especially talented, but I have the basic skills. See, it had a few good marks, but I always needed inspiration from other people's work. My parents tried convincing me to take art at university, but I never listened. Psychology was my main interest. Art was just a stupid hobby with no hope for the future. Shading was my strongest point. I loved using a black pen or pencil to shade a simple still life. It was therapeutic and I enjoyed it. But I was so surprised to see something I created from my own mind. It was nothing special, barely a doodle. It was two circles and a smile, nothing at all. After a while, it became creepy. My friends would comment whenever they saw it. It unnerved them. Its blank stare would watch them from the page, following them as they moved. For a stupid scribble, it carried a terrifying atmosphere, staring straight at you as if it was trying to communicate. But it only ever appeared a couple times a week. It would just pop up in my head and I'd get this overwhelming feeling that I had to draw it. But as soon as I added the last tooth, that was it. I barely registered drawing it at all. Every time my friends would complain, I'd just laugh. It sounded so stupid to be frightened by a sketch. It was during the 6th or 7th week that I sensed something was wrong. The face slowly grew. It began to consume the margins of my books as if fighting for attention. Each time I finished class, I'd realize just how little I focused. That wasn't like me. I was organized, studious. But for a few hours, I had been consciously devoting my time to drawing this odd face. It never altered. Each doodle looked exactly alike. The pen strokes were precise. The faces held the same jagged features. Why did I draw him? Where had I seen him before? I began to wonder if I had actually made him up. There was something oddly real about him. But it was only a drawing, of course. Weeks began to melt into each other as the obsession grew. My hand felt dead without the weight of the pen. I had to draw. I filled so many notebooks with just his face. The pages looked black with his features. I began feeling paranoid when I was deprived from him. I couldn't think straight. It was like the thoughts didn't belong to me. That was when I realized he was something more. He was whispering to me. This thing I craved was actually alive and inside my head. We'd speak to each other whenever I was alone. In public, he'd speak and I'd listen instead of talking to someone real. My mind was clouded. I knew the rational response was to question it, but I couldn't. His voice was eerie but comforting. I'd only realized the insanity of the situation when he was quiet. When I was alone, I panicked. So many questions ran through my head, but they'd disappear every time he returned. Every day I began to see his face everywhere I went. Logos, smudges, other people's doodles. Everything molded into the shape of that strange face. I felt panicked at first, but there was a relief in seeing him. I felt so much pleasure when I finished the page and stared at the many faces. It felt like an achievement, creating colonies of him in my books. It scared but excited me. This unnerving figure haunted me daily. He was everywhere. He was in my head completely. Drawing became my life. It was a need, an obsession. I would hide inside my room, not for myself, but for everyone else. When I started to hear him constantly, I hid. If I drew him in front of people, they'd become hypnotized. It was only for a minute. Their face would contort into a surprised but curious expression. My friends would ask him about him. They wanted to know where he came from, if I had created him for a purpose. The concern they originally felt dissolved into curiosity, and I was afraid. They started drawing too. I could see the interest rise in the people I loved, and so I stayed away. I couldn't let him take them. I couldn't let him consume anyone else. My parents rang so many times, but I had to ignore them. As soon as I noticed their faces drift towards his, I knew I had to be alone. I had to cut myself off from the world to keep control. It was so difficult. I could feel his rage. I could feel his need to grow. Whenever I needed food, I ordered online. I needed to limit my interactions with others and lock him in. Sometimes when I was tired from fighting, he would move a hand or jerk my chest. It was terrifying, but I stayed in control. I couldn't let him out. Even whilst outside, my hand would twitch. The absent pen was like a missing limb, a phantom addiction that would never cease. I had to leave my room on occasions for him to stretch his legs. I tried to take him to secluded places I didn't think he'd appreciate, but he did. Our trips would strengthen him, but they also meant that he'd loosen his grip of me for a few days out of gratitude. A strange relationship began to grow between us. After a few months, I understood why he gave me those few days to breathe. He was just getting started. There was so much more to his plan. The impulse to draw would turn into an excruciating pain. It was impossible to be empty-handed. I needed the pen. There were days when I'd black out, waking from unconsciousness, still holding a pen of some sort. I could feel tendrils of darkness squirm into my arms, taking control of my tendons, forcing me to draw. Very quickly, ink became useless. We experimented with so many things: paint, chalk, wood, charcoal, anything I could obtain. But he was never happy. He wanted more. He wanted a tool with more life. When the voices began, that's when I knew I was trapped. This thing had captured me and transferred me into his world. I would draw until my fingers bled and the pages ran out. He planted his image in my mind and tortured me until I could capture it in reality. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be a part of our world. But who or what was he? I never knew what he wanted, and I'm not sure that I ever truly found out. The blackouts went from days to weeks. Instead of pages of ink, there were pages of blood. My hands would be scratched and sliced, bleeding constantly. They never healed. Each time they scabbed over, they'd be ripped again. He loved working with blood. My nails had somehow grown into claw-like razors covered my shriveled flesh. I never remembered the moments he took over. I just remember waking up in intense pain. The first time I awoke from a blackout, I screamed in horror. The room was covered in my blood, and in his face, blood-spattered knives lay about the floor, each one dulled from the night he spent with them. Each time he never went on or above the wrists, never hurt anything other than my hands. He couldn't risk hitting an artery. I'd spend so many hours crying, pleading him to leave. He would only reply with, "Show me." Show him what? His self? I never understood what that meant until one of our last trips together. One night, sitting on an empty train, I stared through the window, wishing for it to end. As the conductor made his round, he would suddenly yell, "Show me," inside my head. It grew louder as the conductor moved closer. Then I realized he wanted me to show him off again. He wanted me to draw him in public like I I had during my lectures. He wanted to grow. The horror of that sudden realization gripped my chest with iron claws. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. As the conductor found his way to my seat, he asked if I was okay. Clearly, the horror was plain on my face. I clenched my hands, feeling the woolen gloves scrape my fresh wounds. Luckily, I had thought ahead, and my monthly ticket lay beside me. The conductor looked between me and the ticket for some minutes. The face materialized in front of my eyes, contorting the stranger's head into the scribbled features. I pointed at my ticket and laid my head against the window as a sign to be left alone. The conductor sensed my anxiety and left the carriage after scrutinizing the ticket a final time. I heard him speaking to the driver soon after. He was concerned for me and was told to keep an eye out. They even considered asking for the police at the next stop, but I'd already be gone by then. As soon as the train doors slid open, I ran. I ran as far away from people as I could. I ran till my legs couldn't carry me. All the while, he whispered inside. There was no pause, no silence, just a never-ending scream for him to be shown. I sobbed for hours listening to him shout and demand the drawings. I was in some sort of field behind the town. I traveled as far as I could and stopped through sheer exhaustion. There was never a chance for me to rest with him there. Even after the blackouts, I felt like I hadn't slept in months. The crying had weakened me, and he suddenly took control. My legs began walking towards the houses, but it wasn't long before the obsession took over and it gave up. He would have preferred to have been drawn in town, but the field would have to do until then. I screamed, internally demanding control of my body. I felt the pain as he ripped off my gloves, breaking my fresh scabs that had formed. Taking a rock, he sliced my hands, cutting across fingers and grazing the skin until there was nothing left. He reduced my hands to a bloody mess. Everything was a canvas to him. The grass, trees, even the remnants of an old fence. He drew his face over and over again, ripping off the skin whenever the blood flow weakened. Anything as a weapon, cans, rocks, wire, everything he found he used to reopen my wounds. I screamed in agony, but no one would have ever been able to hear it. We stayed like that for about an hour, him guiding my body around the field whilst I silently cried. I was thankful that he was too absorbed to think about moving towards civilization. Every time he'd think about a public place, he'd be distracted by another possible canvas. He, too, was obsessed. It was too late and too dark for anyone to have noticed us. I daren't think what he would have done if a stranger had offered help. He had shown me before that night images of him gutting my family and creating faces with their intestines. It was one of the reasons I decided to isolate myself. Because of him, I had a desire to kill that I battled with every day. For most of the night, I was unaware of what he was doing, but every so often he'd allow me to watch, to feel the pain he was inflicting onto my body, but he made sure I was awake for the main event. The masterpiece was me. Sitting on the grass, he lifted my shirt and cut. The chest became a canvas as he scraped his image into me. He was carving himself into my flesh, branding me as his. Blood flooded constantly, covering the ground below. Muscle began to protrude as he sliced deeper, finishing the final details. My body ached all over. The pain radiated through every nerve. I cried and screamed and begged for him to kill me, but mercy never came. I just writhed in pain, hearing him laughing manically. Once my body grew weak from the blood loss, he let me go. He gave control back to me. He drifted to the back of my mind, allowing me to rest. I lay on the grass for hours, covered in a pool of my own blood. I was so tired, I was scared to sleep, but I couldn't help but drift off every so often. I was so weak, he laughed at me, proud of his masterpiece, but it wasn't finished. I knew that. It had to be stopped somehow. I had to be stopped. In the silence, I heard a faint rushing sound in the distance. Water. Raising my head, I could see the tall banks of a river's edge. Without thinking, I carried myself off the ground. I had hardly any strength, but I was determined to walk. There was no reasoning, no thought process. I just walked. The voices halted out of confusion, waiting to see what I'd do, but I didn't know. I just had to reach the water. Scared, he started moaning and asking me to stop. I'd trip as he tried manipulating my legs, but I couldn't rest. I was compelled forward. I had to stop him somehow. It felt like hours until I reached the high edge of the river, but it must have only taken minutes. He screamed, sensing my plan, but I was too tired. I just wanted to stop, wanted him to leave. Looking over, I smiled with relief to the rushing water. Exhausted, I fell. My whole body became limp as I relaxed and allowed myself to become enveloped by the waves. He screamed continuously until I was under, then silence. It was so peaceful. The current guided me under, but I didn't care. I accepted it. I accepted its plans for me. I relaxed and sank deeper. The moonlight became distant and distorted under the water's surface. It was beautiful. Closing my eyes, I sank further and further. I became numb with cold, became content with further under I went. I felt weightless, yet heavy, alive, yet dying. There was no twitch, no need to draw. There was no him. Concerned for a moment, I opened my eyes. Above me was a black cloud dancing in the water. A dust so fine it looked like charcoal powder. We spent so many nights capturing his image in charcoal. It swayed slowly, forming a larger silhouette. It was him. Rising to the surface, the formation distorted itself into his face. He smiled and waved with the non-existent hand. As I fell, he fought the water and rose. He finally left. I was alone for the first time in I don't even know how long. Satisfied, I closed my eyes and let go.
Well, that was a lengthy and riveting and frightening story. Thank you for your submittance. We have time for one more. Yes, you there. The Confession of a Clown by Inum al-AI. I knew Jack as the clown who would laugh if his ass was on fire. And there was no problem with that, because for as long as I had known him, his sense of humor had been a little strange. To be honest, if you have ever felt low and needed cheering up after hearing your folks row for the 10th time in under 24 hours, or if you have sadly broken up with a two-timing bitch, he'd be the go-to guy. To take your mind off that shit, his comedy skills knew of no bounds. And thanks to that, you'd be hurling up your stomach contents courtesy of your mom's now wasted lunch money she gave you due to being painfully gripped in fits of hysterics. That was the life raft you needed when the shit started to try and drown you. Yeah, while the other kids in my crappy little town would get drunk or high to escape their problems, I would go to get Jack. But here's the thing, you may have noticed by now, you're pretty stupid if you haven't. I wouldn't be writing this story on Jack if he was the oh-so-perfect guy, right? Of course not. Through my experiences in life, I've discovered that nobody is perfect. And yeah, Jack was the main catalyst for this belief. Here's why. High school is over, and we excitedly delved ideally into our 5 minutes of beautiful freedom before it was cruelly torn away from us by the warnings from our folks over having to find jobs. I noticed a change in Jack. He became despondent with life, friends, and worst of all, comedy. I tried pressing him for answers as to what was going on inside his head. His parents tried, and I'm afraid to say none of us were as successful getting through to a skull that was thicker than Kim Kardashian's moon-like crater Zinal ass. However, everything was soon revealed to us in the form of a suicide note that his mom found placed neatly amongst his most prized possessions for some reason. By his corpse, Jack had cut his wrist wide open. Apparently, he had been suffering from terrifying hallucinations for several months. He claimed he had a demonic-looking clown soaked in blood following him wherever he went, accompanied by the sound of its high-pitched cackling and growling threats that pushed him to the edge. Life stopped being funny to him,
at that point. And the same went for me after discovering that he had been going through that. Yeah, sure, my wit and wisecrack jokes remain intact, but they're just copying mechanisms I'm used to bringing you this tale. If I don't have the memory of Jack, the good times I shared with him, in this cruel, unforgiving, and unfunny world, I would probably be dead too. And it's a big help to me when I'm alone with my thoughts going over and over about what I did. Please don't judge me too harshly, but I thought Jack could cope with anything. He always seemed so resilient. I thought he was one of those indestructible punch bags that could take as much abuse as possible and would keep going back for more. It seemed like he could laugh anything off, but not the image of me as that demonic clown drenched in blood. Remember when I mentioned that two-timing bitch earlier? I always made her laugh. Always. But not in the end. You see, I killed her, and Jack saw me do it. I laughed just like the Joker while doing it. Doing what? Chopping her slutty head and neck off of her shoulders with my dad's axe, following by cutting her limbs from off her torso and stuffing them into a trash bag right where she belonged. My God, the adrenaline rush was believable. My friends, I found it funny. Jack didn't. As for those threats against him, I had to make sure he didn't confess. The only thing I wanted him to do was make me laugh, but he couldn't live with himself. The idiot. He wasn't perfect. My parents don't like them. Maybe they'll die too. Just joking.
Well then, I believe that is all the time we have today. Oh, I'm sorry. Did you have one more? Okay, well the producer's telling me we have time for one more. Are you sure this guy's... Oh, okay, here we are.
Dead Eyes by Malik. Mom always said that you were her precious. I noticed how she took more care for you than she did of me. She was the one true saint throughout all this madness. She trusted you, and you threw it away like a piece of unwanted love. I sit here, now writing in a small pool of my own blood, waiting, hopefully, for someone to come by and see me. But we all know that will not happen. In my mind, being trapped in this godforsaken basement riddled with nothing other than the stench of rotting flesh and of blood would be the last place to stay for me. Yet, something holds me strong here, tugging and pulling, saying, "Not yet, just stay a while longer." Is it the way I see the world now, only to realize that where I am at this moment is the safest for me? I don't know exactly. The reason I'm writing this is that no other woman or child can make the same mistake with their beloved. No matter how safe you feel with anyone, including family, have your small doubts. Keep them in the back of your mind. More and more, you will start to realize how the innocence of a small boy or girl can turn into complete evil. My brother Daniel has a lot of very special characteristics. Ones you don't see on every person. In actuality, he's one hell of a human being, ranging from his awards and certificates to accomplishments in everyday life. I looked up to him, idolized him. Maybe not as much as others, but it was still there. Mom, Cheryl, is a very wise woman, always thinking past what people say or do, try and put herself in the shoes of others to understand more. Sometimes she even seems more reluctant to show affection and love to us, rather to our ideals and studies. As for my dad, he is not a part of whatsoever in this. As I am Elric, I won't talk about myself all that much. I quite don't know myself anymore, to be honest. honest. All I know is that I was the odd one out. The child that would eat lunch by himself at school in the cafeteria, or staying in his room most of the time reading books trying to pass time. It was never fun though. There was never any fun in our house. An almost similar toned infinity ticking clock, as if time was taking a Sunday stroll. That day, that one day when it all happened so fast, too fast for anyone to say or do anything, not even knowing why or how, all we could do was protect the ones we love. 6:42 a.m. The alarm rang and woke me up. Time for school. Waking up with a disgruntled look on my face, I went into the bathroom to freshen up. 7:08 a.m. One bowl of delicious cereal. 7:26 a.m. Time to leave for the bus. Stop. Realized that Daniel was outside, which is unlikely because he wakes up an hour after me. He was shirtless, wearing blue and white striped boxers and out in the freezing cold of hell. I only saw his back, but it was more than enough to tell me that he was acting very strange, much like he was in a trance. Then suddenly, I see a girl appear right in front of him. This girl looked like no one I'd seen before, with the darkest of hair and most luminescent eyes, almost like a silhouette, but devilish in a way. Daniel then started to kneel in front of her, staring up into her transcending eyes, those chronic pale white eyes, dead eyes. Then the shadowed girl then bends over and gave what looked like to be a kiss on the forehead. Daniel pulled his head back all the way, as if he was given the best feeling in the world and was letting it out. Instantly, he lets out a full scream of hatred, almost to the point where I thought he would break his vocal cords. The sky turned into a dark, depressing hue of purple and deep blue, almost like a mythical thunderstorm. I yelled out his name, "Daniel! What are you doing? Get your ass inside!" He didn't respond. Instead, I heard Mother yelling and screaming from upstairs, calling out for help. I looked back to see if Daniel was still there, but he was gone. I rushed to her bedroom door, but it was locked and wouldn't budge. I yelled out her name, multiple names. "Mom! Mom, what's going on?" She just kept screaming over and over again. These blood-curdling screams would always haunt me forever. I tried smashing down the door, but it still wouldn't move. My mom's still screaming. I yell in anger as I try to break down the door that was holding me still in my way. With one final blow, I knocked down the entire door completely, and I see Daniel holding onto my mother's throat as she screams for her life. A burst of righteous morale sent me charging towards my brother, tackling him to the floor. He rebounds quickly and pushes me with such force that sent me to the other side of the room. I felt my arm and some ribs break during the process. I get up and made the decision to try and save myself. As I leave the bedroom, I hear Daniel scream, "Do you love me now?" And my mom's screams come to a halt. He choked her. With his bare hands, he choked the life out of her mother. I dart out of the room, downstairs with a broken arm, broken ribs, and tears running down my cheeks. I rapidly looked around for a place to hide and found that the basement was the best decision. I go down into the basement and lock the door behind me. It was dark, only a dim light bulb illuminated the room. I sit down, exhausted from the immense pain that I was in, only to find out that I had just locked myself in this house with my own killer brother, if he was ever considered my brother anymore. I sat down in this basement for what has seemed like 3 days of my own blood. I constantly hear scratching noises coming from the door above, the stairwell that leads into my kitchen. I also began hallucinating, seeing, even smelling my mother's rotting corpse in the corner of the basement. I knew it wasn't real, but my God, it felt like my mother was right there. I could even say that I saw her body twitch sometimes. Now I lay here, just looking at my mother's defiled, rotting body, listening to the scratching noise near the door. My mouth dry as the Sahara Desert, my stomach, the feeling of being punctured by a knife constantly, and my arm, the bone-aching pain. I know couldn't handle this much longer. I would die from the thirst and hunger. But what could I do exactly? I'm not the man that would make it in the end of a horror story. This is reality, whether you think it is or isn't. I'm trapped in an endless hell in my own nightmare, my own fear. I sit here just waiting in silence until suddenly the light bulb diminishes. No light. I hear movement coming from the corner of the room. Oh God, it couldn't have been my mom. She's dead. Everyone is dead. And the door from the upstairs breaks open clean. I'm just sitting here listening more attentively than before in my life or these past 3 days. I'm staring at the darkness, trying to make some figure of anything that's in front of me, but it seems hopeless. I can feel myself fading away, ready to pass into a higher life. Hopefully, before nothing else reaches me, the sense of dread was overwhelming. I took into consideration my accomplishment in life, only to realize that I did nothing special. Only regrets were made. Until my feet start to tickle like something was playing with it. I look at my feet, then look up only to see my brother's and my mother's dark figures in front of me. I cry in fear of my life, the life I wish I had before all this happened. My own world. Now, all I see in front of me are those luminescent eyes, those pale white eyes staring at me, at my soul, those dead eyes.
Well, that was an interesting story as well. I suppose we're going to wrap it up there. So if you'd like to hear more stories, join us next week. Be sure to click the like button, comment, support us on Patreon and Multiverse Infinitum. And yes, until next time.